All right, let's jump into this, shall we? Today's deep dive is something I think will resonate with a lot of us, especially in the RLSH world. It's about the warrior spirit,
Yeah.
and how to sort of be a warrior, but non-violently. We got a ton of great material from you guys for this one. Everything from philosophy and personal stories from some RLSH out there to news articles and even some religious and spiritual perspectives.
Quite the mix, yeah.
So what we're going to try to do is unpack all this stuff and see what it really means to be this kind of, nonviolent warrior, right?
Yeah.
Especially for those of us trying to make a difference out there.
Yeah, sounds like a contradiction in terms, right? A warrior who doesn't use violence.
Well, yeah. But a lot of what you sent in seems to point to this idea of inner strength being more important than, like, just physical strength.
Yeah.
You know?
More about resilience, right? And that dedication to a cause, like even when things get tough.
Exactly. One of the articles even compared it to the Sikh concept of spiritual warriors. It's like
Yeah.
they combine that inner strength with action,
Mm-hmm.
doing good in the world.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how this idea pops up all over the place, across different cultures, different philosophies.
Like we see that in Zen Buddhism, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was that piece by Angel Kyoto Williams talking about how the Buddha himself came from a warrior clan. But he, channeled all that warrior energy towards peace.
It's taking all that discipline, that courage, all the stuff we associate with warriors, but redirecting it, using it for positive change.
And that's where that Shambhala vision comes in, right?
Yeah, the idea that to create a more enlightened society, you have to start with individuals.
Each person kind of cultivating their own inner warrior.
Exactly.
So we're building this picture of a warrior who's not just about aggression, it's about purpose.
Yeah.
But then we hit a snag, right? You shared that Reddit discussion. And, well, a lot of people were concerned about whether nonviolence is really just a privilege, something that only works if you're already in a relatively safe environment.
Yeah, a lot of folks were saying if you're facing a direct threat, pacifism just isn't going to cut it.
So how do we reconcile that?
Yeah. Right. It's a real dilemma for a lot of RLSH. If someone's breaking into your home, how do you respond?
There's no easy answer.
No, it's complex. But a lot of what we got from you guys, in terms of source material, offers another perspective, focusing on the power of nonviolent resistance.
You mean showing that it can actually be effective, even in really tough situations?
Yeah, exactly.
And we have those examples from history, right? I mean, Gandhi's Satyagraha movement in India, he led a whole nation to freedom, using nonviolent resistance against British rule.
It was all about holding on to the truth, even when facing, incredible oppression.
And those ideas didn't just work in India. Think about Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement. He used a lot of Gandhi's approach, right? And it helped dismantle some seriously messed up systems.
And how about Lemigobi and those women in Liberia?
Oh, yeah, the women's peace movement.
They literally ended a civil war through prayer and peaceful protest.
Talk about warrior spirit. So these examples, they really show us that nonviolent resistance isn't passive. It's not weak. It takes real strength and courage to stand up for what's right without resorting to, violence.
It's about channeling that warrior spirit into a form of action that's assertive, but not aggressive.
Exactly.
Satyagraha, for instance, that emphasizes converting your opponent, not coercing them.
It's about recognizing our shared humanity, right? Even in the middle of a conflict.
Yeah, but that brings us to another challenge, doesn't it? How do you maintain that nonviolence when you're being met with aggression?
Especially when you're in the heat of the moment, right? Like that South Central Farms protest, that was in one of the news articles. They had media attention, even celebrities. But they also had to deal with a pretty heavy police response.
How do you hold on to those principles when things get intense?
Yeah.
That's where insight comes in.
Yeah.
You need compassion to fuel that desire to act, to make a difference. But you also need insight
To what?
to avoid burning out, to make strategic decisions,
Oh.
to see the big picture.
To keep a cool head.
Exactly.
So it's about having the heart of a warrior, but also the mind of a strategist.
Yeah, you could say that. And this ties into another important point from the sources, addressing our own inner violence.
Oh, right, like that Shambhala training stuff.
Yeah, that emphasizes the idea that the line between good and evil, it runs through all of us.
We all have that capacity for anger, for aggression.
And before we can really address any external conflict, we've got to confront those inner demons.
So we got to work on ourselves before we can go out and work on the world.
Exactly.
And those sources offer some pretty practical advice for doing that. Like a lot of them talk about meditation and mindfulness, for calming the mind, becoming more aware of your thoughts and emotions.
Right, and remember that Sunday soul connection piece?
Hmm.
Talking about channeling that warrior energy into action, doing things like volunteering or supporting causes.
So finding ways to use those emotions for something positive.
Yeah, to fuel positive change.
Yeah. And that example you sent of Jenny Giovanetti's call to action, that was really powerful, inspired by that Rainbow Warrior prophecy.
Hmm.
It's a good reminder that we can't just stay in our little bubbles.
We have to step up, fight for what we believe in, but do it in a way that aligns with our values.
So recognizing we're all connected to each other, our communities, the planet, and acting accordingly,
Being a warrior for the greater good.
not just for ourselves.
Yeah.
So how do we, as RLSH especially, how do we reconcile that warrior spirit with nonviolence? How do we become those nonviolent warriors who are actually making a difference out there?
That's the big question, right? And it's something we'll definitely dive into deeper next time.
Oh yeah, we've got a lot more to unpack.
But what's clear from everything we've looked at so far is that it's a journey, not a destination.
It's about constantly working on ourselves, our actions, motivations,
Understanding the world around us.
and doing it together, supporting each other as we, navigate this whole thing.
Right. It's a community of warriors working to make the world a better place through nonviolent action.
I love that.
Ah.
Community of warriors. Huh?
Yeah.
But how do we actually put all this into practice? How do we train for this kind of warriorhood? Well, we'll explore those questions in part 2, so stay tuned.
You know, one thing that keeps coming up in these sources is that idea of inner transformation. Like, it's the foundation for actually, doing stuff, taking action non-violently.
Okay, yeah, like that whole Shambhala thing we were talking about. The real battle is within ourselves. But how does that actually translate into action out in the field, Especially for an RLSH. We're not all monks meditating on a mountaintop.
Right, yeah. And none of the sources are saying we should just be passive either.
Yeah.
Remember that warrior spirit. It's about engagement, commitment to a cause. It's just that for RLSH, the field of action might look different.
So instead of just like rushing into a situation, it's more about really assessing, understanding what's going on,
Right, yeah.
and then figuring out how to intervene in the most effective way, but
Right.
without violence.
Exactly. It might involve using those de-escalation techniques to try to calm things down or finding a way to resolve a conflict peacefully. Sometimes it could even mean just being a witness to injustice, and then using whatever platform you have to amplify the voices of those who are being ignored or silenced.
So it's not always about physical intervention.
Not always, no.
Sometimes it's more about using your voice, your influence to make a difference.
The key is recognizing that the most powerful weapon isn't always a physical one. Sometimes it's about an unwavering commitment to truth and justice.
I like that. But okay, let's be real for a second. There are going to be those times when physical intervention seems unavoidable. What about those situations where someone's being attacked or things are escalating really quickly?
It's a tough question, and the sources don't pretend to have easy answers, but there are some interesting insights. Like, even in the face of something as horrific as the Holocaust, Gandhi maintained that civil resistance was the only moral path,
Wow,
even if it meant putting yourself in harm's way.
that's incredible. But is there a point where self-defense becomes not just acceptable, but actually necessary?
That's where the concept of ahimsa, or non-harming, gets really tricky. It's about intention.
So protecting yourself or someone else, that could align with ahimsa.
If your intention is to minimize harm,
Not to inflict it out of anger or revenge.
right, it's not about punishment, it's about protection.
So it comes down to motivation and
Yeah.
proportionality, right? Like if you have to use force, it should be the absolute minimum.
The minimum necessary to stop the harm.
And the goal should always be to protect, not to punish.
Exactly, and that's a hard balance to strike. It takes constant self-awareness and training.
Which luckily are key parts of that warrior spirit we're talking about.
Where those inner battles, they're ongoing. You never reach a point where you're like, okay, I'm perfectly nonviolent now.
So it's a practice.
It's a commitment to keep refining your actions and your motivations.
That makes sense. But how do we, as RLSH, actually train for this kind of warriorhood? It's not like there's a Shambhala dojo for superheroes.
Yeah. Maybe not a formal dojo, no. But the sources give us some good ideas, like those meditation and mindfulness practices.
Right, those can help build awareness. So you don't just react impulsively or get caught up in anger.
Exactly.
So you can stay calm and focused, even under pressure.
Exactly. And those excerpts you sent from Sunday Soul Connection, they talked about how even little acts of service, like volunteering, can be a way to channel that warrior energy.
It's about doing good in everyday life.
Yeah, using that drive you have.
It's like training those nonviolent muscles all the time, not just when you're in costume.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that the warrior spirit isn't just for those big battles, it's for those everyday choices, those small acts of courage that help build a more just and compassionate world.
And speaking of action,
Yeah.
let's talk about the difference between pacifism and nonviolence. Those words, they seem like they mean the same thing, but
Yeah, people use them interchangeably sometimes, but there is a distinction. Generally speaking, pacifism is that absolute stance against all violence, no matter what. Nonviolence, as we've been discussing, is more about actively resisting injustice and harm, while minimizing violence whenever possible.
so a pacifist might refuse to defend themselves even when attacked, whereas someone committed to nonviolence might use force, but only as a last resort,
Yeah.
and only in a way that aligns with that idea of ahimsa, of not harming.
Exactly. And that's where the sources get really interesting. They really emphasize the importance of understanding your opponent
Trying to find common ground.
and working towards reconciliation, if at all possible.
Yeah, it's like that quote from Gandhi about how the Satyagrahi's goal
Mm-hmm.
is to convert, not to coerce. It's like flipping the script on that whole us versus them mentality.
Yeah, it's a radical shift in perspective.
But that's what makes it so powerful.
It's based on the understanding that even your opponent is human, someone capable of changing, of growing.
So it's not about condoning their actions, but it's about seeing them as part of a bigger picture.
A bigger web of interconnection.
It takes a lot of compassion to be able to do that.
It does. It takes compassion and insight. Compassion to connect with the suffering of others, even those who have done wrong. And insight to help us see those underlying causes of the conflict, the injustice.
Which brings us back to something we touched on earlier. For a lot of people, nonviolence isn't just a tactic. It's a way of life.
It informs your actions, your thoughts, your emotions.
So it's about cultivating that warrior spirit in every aspect of yourself.
It becomes who you are, not just something you do.
Okay, so we've got this picture of the warrior spirit, fueled by compassion and insight, focused on minimizing harm, committed to converting rather than coercing.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful framework.
But for an RLSH who's just starting out, where do they even begin?
Well, the sources offer some really practical advice. It starts with self-reflection. Spend some time thinking about your motivations, your beliefs. What drives you to be an RLSH? What are your strengths, your weaknesses? And then never stop learning. Read about nonviolent movements, study conflict resolution, practice mindfulness.
That's like any skill, right? The more you train, the better you get.
Exactly. And don't forget about community. Connect with other RLSH who share your values. Build a network of support. People who can challenge you and inspire you.
People who have your back.
Yeah,
And that's where shows like this one come in, right?
absolutely.
We're all in this together, exploring these ideas, sharing perspectives, figuring out how to apply them in our own lives.
It's about creating that space for dialogue, for asking questions, for learning and growing together.
It's about community. But it's not just about surrounding ourselves with people who already agree with us, right? What about those who don't share our views, who might even be hostile towards us? That's a whole other challenge.
It is.
And that's where we're headed next time. It is a whole other
Yeah.
challenge, isn't it? Trying to engage with people who, well, maybe aren't on the same page as us,
Right.
especially for RLSH who are out there dealing with things head on.
For sure. And you know that thing we were talking about from the Shambhala teachings, that the line between good and evil runs through everyone. It means we got to be willing to engage with folks who have different views, even those who we might see as, adversaries.
That's hard sometimes, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Especially when you're dealing with people who are aggressive or even violent themselves.
Yeah.
How do we stay true to those nonviolent principles when we're facing that kind of hostility?
It's a real challenge, no doubt about it. But a lot of those sources you sent, they talk about the power of dialogue, of really listening. It's about trying to understand where the other person is coming from, even if you completely disagree with what they're doing.
Like that Gandhi quote about seeking to convert, not coerce,
Exactly.
appealing to someone's better nature.
Even if it's buried under a lot of anger and prejudice.
And those sources also made it clear, this isn't about being passive or weak. It takes a lot of strength to stand up for what you believe in, especially when you're facing down hostility or even violence.
Absolutely. That's where the warrior spirit really comes in.
That unwavering commitment.
Yeah, that refusal to back down, even when it's tough or dangerous.
So sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to meet violence with violence.
Break that cycle of escalation.
Show them There's another way.
Yeah.
But what about when talking just seems impossible, like the other person is totally closed off? What do you do then?
That's when those practices, the self-reflection, the insight, those become even more crucial. Remember, it's about trying to understand the root of the problem, the systems of injustice that are often creating these situations in the first place.
Well, it's not always about focusing on that individual person.
Sometimes it's about looking at the bigger picture, the structures that make violence more likely to happen.
And working to change those.
Exactly.
So for RLSH, it's not just about stopping the bad guy right now. It's about working to create a world where there are fewer bad guys to begin with.
Right. Maybe it's working with at-risk youth,
What?
or advocating for social justice reforms, or even just being a positive influence in your own community.
Showing people that there's another way.
Using that warrior spirit to inspire others.
To show them a different way to be powerful. A different way to make a real difference.
To be a beacon of hope.
A symbol of nonviolent action.
Yeah, a living, breathing example of those values we've been talking about.
And that's a powerful legacy for any warrior, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's about inspiring others to keep fighting the good fight, long after you're gone.
Planting those seeds of change, nurturing them with compassion, and having faith that they'll blossom into a future where violence isn't the norm.
It's the exception.
And that's a future worth fighting for, even if the battles are fought in our hearts and minds, not just in the streets.
Absolutely.
So, to everyone listening out there, think about what really spoke to you in this deep dive. How can you cultivate your own warrior spirit? Channel it into nonviolent action.
Where can you find that community of support? Those allies who will help you on this path?
And how can you be that beacon of hope, that example of positive change that the world needs so much right now?
It's a journey, no doubt.
But it's a journey worth taking. And who knows, maybe together we can create a world where the warrior spirit and nonviolence aren't just compatible, they're inseparable. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep fighting the good fight, peacefully and powerfully.